Okay. So I think the second half is actually a little longer than the first half, but since most of us aren't really looking at new sites, we'll kind of skip through that aspect pretty quickly. Okay, so this programming phase is kind of the initial design phase of your project. Your architect can help you with this, or you can do a lot of this yourself. The architect will probably need to do some of it just to verify a few things anyway, but a large part of it can be done by your church. So programming is really just about determining what your project is, what your desires are, what your needs are. If you know what your budget is, that can be included. So it's important to get some congregational involvement, and on a larger project, especially, it's kind of nice to just get everybody together for like a fellowship event where the project is talked about. So you get people involved. I mean, you kind of want to limit. You don't want to get it all drawn out into a big, huge event. But you do want to hear from people. And so there are ways to just get people's feedback on big ideas. So like if we're doing a sanctuary, you know, what 2 or 3 words would you use to describe your dream sanctuary? Just to get, I mean, because sanctuaries vary from church to church as well. I mean, a lot of people like natural light or stained glass, but nowadays people are going more towards, we don't want any natural light because we want to control the environment electronically. So, you know, it varies across the board. But so just getting people together and giving them the opportunity to give you feedback in a controlled situation is good. Because then, you know, you can take those ideas and incorporate them, or if, you know, if they may not always get incorporated, but it gives them the opportunity to participate. Okay, generally there's a questionnaire or a survey that the leadership will go through to provide information on what they see from their perspective that's needed. And like I just talked about, in the nursery situation in my church, no one person, except for maybe the pastor, no one person's going to know everything about the needs for your church. So you need to get, you know, those key people involved and get their input. Then you're going to interview the key people to get their pertinent information. Then your architect is going to have discussions with your building committee to get more information. It's important, I think we already talked about this a little bit, but think big and think beyond. This planning stage is a time to dream. There's always the reality of the budget, which is going to draw it back in, but initially you need to think big, because if you don't think big, you're not going to get big. So think big and think beyond. Don't get, like I said earlier, don't get trapped into thinking about your tradition or what you've done in the past or whatever, or you can't do this because of that limitation. Think about what happens if that limitation is removed. Think about where you really want to be. Okay, so the result of this programming or discovery phase is a programming document, and that programming document is generally a text document that describes the needs and the desires of the church for the project. So it's a written description of the problem. Does that make sense? So it describes the spaces that you need, approximate size that you need, and all those. Then there's also, you know, like the touchy-feely things, like what kind of an environment we really want in this space and that sort of thing. But just stating in words the project. Okay, then there's establishing a budget, and there are different ways to look at this as well. You're going to use your program as your guide for establishing your budget. So with your program, you're already going to know if you do everything in your program, you're going to have a rough idea how many square feet you're talking about for new space and remodel space, and you can apply square footage numbers to those and get a ballpark number for where you're at. Now sometimes it's most desirable for the need to drive the budget so that you know what your ministry needs are, and you can, by using the program, you're going to get to the budget that you need to reach that. But sometimes, unfortunately, the budget drives the need. And so when we get into master planning, we're going to talk about phasing your project so that while maybe you can't afford everything today, you can build it so that you can add on to it later.
Yeah, that when you were talking about the budget driving the need, I'm fearful that a lot of the buildings that get built sometimes, and they end up being kind of mishmashy, because that's been the case. And they didn't have a master plan that said, well, you can do this and then expand upon it, was set up to do.
That's why master planning is important, so that you know where you're going over the long term, even though you may not be able to get there in your first phase. Maybe after the sixth one, you'll be there. But it is unfortunate to let the budget drive your need. Obviously, it's a reality, but it's important to just phase your project so that you can do what you can afford today, but knowing that your goal is to get down the road further. Okay, the major players in construction costs are quantity, quality, and time. So quantity is usually dictated by the need. Quality is the next issue, and obviously sometimes in order to get the quantity, you have to reduce the quality to get there budget-wise. But you don't want to let that get in your way too much as well, because you need to have the quality that's going to last. And time is a factor. You want to make sure that you give yourself enough time to get through the process so that at the end you're not putting pressure on your contractor to get done in a semi-unreasonable amount of time, because that's going to cost money. So start the process early enough, and we'll talk about that at the end of the schedule, but just make sure you start fast enough that time isn't a huge issue. And probably in most church situations, it's not a huge issue, but sometimes it can be. So. And then always make sure you allow for contingency. Construction is imperfect, and there are always costs, especially in additions and remodeling projects, that you will run into that you did not expect.
Do you recommend a set amount you set back, like 5% or?
10% is a good number. In a lesser complicated project that you feel like you can understand pretty well, maybe 5%.
Okay.
I would not do less than 5%.
Okay.
Usually it winds up around, usually doesn't exceed about 5%, but it's always better to be safe than sorry.
I know when we did our remodel, the bid was 3, and we added 10% to that and told the church 92,000 is what we needed, and we're at 87,000 now with a few more additions that'll put us closer to like 90,000. So at least 10%, and in the next phase, I'm recommending we say 15%, because all we're doing right now is remodel. And there was more plumbing and more concrete that needed done than what we had originally planned. And it wasn't the only one thing I'd say the architect didn't, that was and that was on our outside exit ramp, and that was just, it really wasn't the architect, it's just the guts of the building, when you start stripping it away, like, oh, the lights are so old, they burst into flames. Literally, when they were taking out the light bulbs, sparks started shooting out. I mean, it's just, that's just what happens when you have a 40-year-old building. So we figured at 10%, and in the next phase, from here on out, we're gonna figure 15.
Only 40 years.
Yeah, yours might be even worse.
Did one of the remodeling, you find things that you wonder how past muster.
But
Yeah, that's true.
thinking about those cost contributors, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, but the use of volunteer labor, whether it's volunteer Christian builders or your own church members or whatever, how open are contractors to using volunteer labor like that?
Probably, it's gonna vary by your jurisdiction, and I think the guys in Wichita are gonna be less open to that because they have more stringent rules that they're gonna have to follow. In rural situations, it's probably a lot more accepted. Probably gonna find it, it's probably just easier to do.
And in rural situations, if they work with you on those things, you can save quite a bit of labor costs.
Yeah.
I know in El Dorado, they've really cracked down on our codes, and we couldn't, like the Baptist men, they would come in and do electrical or whatever. Not El Dorado, no. Have to have a certified electrician.
Butler County
sure.
certified.
Yeah. I served in a church that we were doing overhaul, I should say, I say overhaul. That's not something like we're doing engine, but doing some renovations and then building on. And it ended up, I was just kind of exploring things to see what kind of, I want to get a copy of the codes and then find out what kind of licensing we need to do. And now this has been a few years ago, but they said, in some communities, probably the same, said, we don't hold the churches to that same standard. You just do what you want to do. And I said, I think it might be a good idea. Sooner or later, you got to want to hold it to the code. So we went and got the codes and did that. But I'm afraid that in times past, some communities have not held churches to the same kind of standards, and consequently, we've had some shoddy work.
Churches are an assembly occupancy, and assemblies are, other than hazardous occupancies where you have explosive materials and whatnot. Assembly,
Those are Baptist churches.
yeah, assembly occupancies are the most stringent, have the most stringent requirements in the code, just because you're dealing with a lot of people and safety issues come into play, so.
Is the architect, he bears the responsibility to know the codes?
He does, and he's held to design to those, and sometimes that's not a popular place to be, but he is held to design to the code. And, depending on your jurisdiction, like probably in Douglas, Kansas, the city review process is probably limited if it exists. But like in Wichita, the architect designs per the code, but the city is gonna review those plans and call your attention to a few things you might have missed, so.
Okay.
And you'll also come in and, they'll look at the project and then they'll okay it till they come in and look at it after it's in too.
Well, that's true. They do the plan review and sign off on that, but then in the field, if something, there may be something that the field inspector notices, but it wasn't on the plans for the contractor to put it in because it just got overlooked, you still have to comply, so, anyway. Okay, so we'll kind of run through this fairly quickly, but if you're looking for a site to relocate to, these are some of the things that you need to be thinking about. Obviously, cost is an issue. Location, are you visible? Are you accessible? And then zoning issues. You need to check into that. There's some interesting things that can happen in the world of zoning, so make sure that something doesn't bite you in that deal. And then, you want to make sure that you know how many people you're trying to accommodate so you can get the right size. And then, what kind of natural features does your site have? Is that an important factor to you? Do you want to take advantage of some of those things and whatnot? Obviously, utilities are important. In most city situations, it's not going to be a problem, but there can be occasions when you get out on the edge of town, and that's kind of the trend in like the Wichita area, people moving to the outskirts, and sometimes you run into a site that hasn't been served with all the utilities, and it can be very expensive to get those utilities to your site. So make sure that you have all the necessary utilities available. Make sure that your storm drainage situation is doable. Kansas, we have a lot of flat territory, and sometimes getting water off your site can be a challenge. Just make sure that you're in good shape there and that you're not in a floodplain. Those items can be solved, but it's not cheap to do. So, soils type may be more difficult to find out about those kinds of things, but make sure that you're not buying a site that has a bunch of fill hauled into it that wasn't placed according to engineered standards, because you'll be pulling all that fill out to get your foundation down to something that can support your building. So make sure you don't move into a site that's been heavily filled unless it was done properly. I mean, a lot of times people will haul trash into a site and it gets covered up and you don't know what's going on, and then try to place a building on it. You'll be going down 10 feet to find that native soil. So anyway, and then environmental issues, just make sure you check that out. Make sure you're not buying a service station site or whatever that's got contamination. Although there can be some financial assistance that you can get from governmental agencies to clean up a site if you want to go down that route. Okay, so one thing to think about as a church, if you're looking to relocate, is to repurpose an existing structure. So Walmart is abandoning their original facilities left and right to do the super centers. Dillon's in our area has abandoned a few buildings. So big box type stores can make pretty good church locations because parking's in place, it's a pretty wide open structure, you can turn it into kind of whatever you want. There's opportunity to make, adjustments as you need for sanctuary. There's restrooms in place, although working with them might be challenging. But a lot of the stuff that you need is already there in a big box situation. Also, yes, sir?
What's a comparison between having a basement or a two-story building?
Typically, it's thought that basement construction is, if you're going to be doing a foundation anyway, going down is cost effective. Problem with that is in today's world and accessibility, sometimes depending on the functions that happen in the basement versus the first floor, as long as you're providing equivalent accommodations at both levels, an elevator's not required. But if you do have to get into an elevator situation, that's pretty much going to destroy any savings that you might have had. Second floor construction is similar thinking. Cost-wise, there's going to be some savings. I don't know if I can't really just throw out a number for you, but there would be some savings in going vertical rather than spreading out. But there are issues to think about going vertical as well. Theaters can make good worship spaces. My former employment situation converted the Palace East into a church facility. So the existing theaters make pretty nice sanctuary, and they are also mostly wide open to create the kind of space that you need. Schools can be converted. I've seen nursing homes converted. It's maybe a little bit more challenging, but the dining room can be converted into a sanctuary and use the sleeping rooms as classrooms and offices. Malls and shopping centers can be converted. There's a story about it's a larger church, more of a mega church in the Chicago area that actually bought a mall that was having some trouble, and they moved their, renovated it to put their church facilities in the mall, but they also left some retail space that they rent out to kind of help them pay for some of their costs. Obviously, your tax deductible situation would come into play there, so you'd want to think through all that. But there are some ways to become a landlord, I guess, and help offset some of your costs. So, in their situation, I think they had like a parking garage, and they had all kinds of infrastructure that made sense to them to purchase that facility and turn it into their church facility. Okay, remodeling and adding on to your existing facility, you're obviously pretty much stuck with what you got, but you need to make sure that you revisit your master plan if you have one, to make sure that it's still relevant, and then just analyze the use of your existing space and the adjacencies of your existing spaces. Do you have places in the right, or rooms in the right place currently, and then analyze your open space for where you can add on to. So as Voight and I were talking out there are obviously some limitations that you have to work with and around in an existing structure situation, but there are nearly always solutions. It's just a matter of time and money. So,
Hey Doug,
yes.
go back and piggyback on his basement question. What do you get into where you might need an elevator?
Well, churches aren't required, a 2-level facility is not required to have an elevator if you have equivalent facilitation on both levels. So
It's
if
going
you-
up or down, up or down.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
So if you're doing classrooms on the lower level, then you need to do classrooms on your main level to make sure that you're accessible to those facilities. So if you have, I'm just gonna throw this out, I don't even know, it's probably maybe not even a good idea, but if you had your fellowship space in the basement and you had no fellowship space on the main level, then you might be forced to do an elevator.
Bathrooms, does that extend to bathrooms? You have to have bathrooms up there?
Actually, well, you have to have some accessible bathrooms, but if you provide bathrooms on the accessible level, then you wouldn't necessarily need to provide them on the inaccessible level.
Mhm.
It's not right on the top of my head, but there are rules about how, I think you can't go more than 2 levels to find a restroom though, so
Okay.
there are some code issues in that regard. But as long as you're providing them on the accessible level though. Now, if you do, I guess this is a point of confusion. A lot of people think that since we have these accessible restrooms, when we do these new restrooms, they don't need to be accessible, but that's not true. Any new restroom facility you do must be accessible. So there's one exception to that, but you don't need to know about it. Okay. Master planning. Okay, so once you've developed your program, you kind of know where you're headed. Master planning is somewhat optional, but definitely recommended by the architect. The master plan is just a graphic document that shows your site and your building and where you would propose future expansion, where you would propose those things being placed. And typically, a master plan in a church situation is gonna be phased. So you can say, this is our first phase, we're gonna do this sanctimasium space, and then, we're gonna wrap it with some classroom.
Never heard it called that.
We're gonna wrap it with some classrooms, and then we're gonna move into that, and then later we're gonna add the real traditional sanctuary, and this original space will become our fellowship hall, and when we add that, we're gonna need more parking and more classroom space. So it just shows where you're gonna go with those things as you grow through time. Now, you need to understand that the master plan is a living document, so what makes sense today may not necessarily make complete sense 10 years from now. It may be mostly correct, but there may need to be some tweaks to it when you revisit it in 10 years, or 5 years, or whatever it is. But so it's not gospel, but it is it's a roadmap for where you need to be thinking about going.
How detailed is a master plan? It's not, it doesn't have construction plans built in it,
Right.
but, I mean, is it pretty much then just an overlay of, you know, this area will be, you know, this sanctuary and, I mean,
It's typically very blocky, I would say. So you block out a space for your sanctuary. You know from your program how much area you need, and you may know a little bit about what shape it wants to be. So you're going to put that block on your plan. And then, you know, as far as your classroom functions, you may actually show individual classrooms, but you're not necessarily going to get into real detail in those. So it's mostly just a definition of space that's been defined by your program, but not extreme detail. That comes along later. Okay, so you're going to, what I recommend is a workshop process, and there are a number of smaller firms who have spun out of the larger firm that I used to work for, and we all kind of buy into the same philosophy, I guess. But the workshop process is kind of it's an interactive, collaborative team effort where we would come in and lay out a plan on a table in the middle of the room that represents the existing conditions, and we'd take our tracing paper and lay over it, and I would hand out pins to each of you, and we would sit down and say, okay, we know we need a new sanctuary, where's the best place to put that, and we'd talk through all of the aspects around that. And I would encourage you to actually participate and draw on the paper if you have ideas of, you know, what if we did this? And you actually participate in the process of laying out your master plan. So your architect he'll come to your workshop with a little bit of a preconceived idea of kind of how things might go, but not in any detail at all, because we need your input. Nobody knows your issues better than you, and we want you to participate in that process of just getting the layout. It's going to be really sketchy, really nothing very spectacular, but the ideas are on paper, and then your architect will take that sketchy stuff and start to pull it together in a little more refined format. So in the end, we're also going to study the site layout and the traffic flow and the parking and the building functions and how they relate to the parking and all those sorts of things. And in the end, you're going to come out with a plan that's going to show your site and how the circulation works around your site and how you access the building entrances and where the major functions of your master plan lay out on your property. Then there's we'll phase that so that, we know that the first most important thing is this aspect of the project, and we know that's where we're going to concentrate our efforts first. And if we have enough money, we'll do phase 2 and phase 3 and so on. So we'll prioritize the elements of our design, and then we'll concentrate on phase 1, or maybe phase 1 and phase 2. But you can put your construction documents or your bidding documents together so that you can get pricing for a couple of different things separately, and then you can determine how far you want to go. So we'll establish the phasing, and then we'll prepare a rough cost estimate for each of those phases. So keep in mind there's probably plus or minus 15% or something to start out, maybe 20% even. So it's going to be really, a loose cost estimate. But we always want to err on the side of conservatism, meaning we want to tell you that it's a little more expensive than hopefully it really is, so that we don't have the opposite surprise in the end, because that is no fun. I've been there.
So after the site plan, or part of the master plan, excuse me, is the architect guesstimating his fees for each phase, or construction fees? for each
Construction
phase?
fees, well, total, you can go as far as you want. Okay, typically the architect is going to be talking about construction dollars. If you want the overall cost of the project, then you'll need to factor in finishes and furnishings, window coverings and all the little details, and then the A&E fees, architectural and engineering fees, to get the total project cost. Intuitively, the architect's going to price the construction costs, and he's going to ignore everything else unless you tell him that you want the total cost, and then you can work together to get to that point.
And you said that may be as much as 20% off, that's just,
It could be as much as 20% off a reality, just because there are so many unknowns at this point. Okay, I didn't really talk about the phase 1 development. We've said, okay, this is the most important phase that we want to work on, or maybe the most important 2 phases. Then we're going to actually concentrate a little bit more effort on those phases and work out a few more details related to those phases so that they're a little bit more, I don't really like using this word, but sellable to your congregation, so that so they have a more clear understanding of what you're really doing. Okay, now this John kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it's important to choose your delivery method fairly early in the process. A lot of people try to avoid this decision as long as possible, but it's important to make it pretty early on. And we'll talk about a couple of reasons for that. We're going to run out of time here. Okay, design, bid, build. That's where the architect kind of leads the process from the beginning. He designs the project and creates the bid documents. Then you give your bid documents to several contractors to get a bid for your project. And then you select the bidder and build the project. So that's been the traditional method of getting from point A to point B over hundreds of years. But in more recent years, now the design, bid, build is pretty much guaranteed to give you the lowest cost. There's no way to get to a lower number than to design, bid, build. So if dollars are of the utmost importance, that's the route you need to take. If relationship and communication and trustability and all those things are more important than dollars, then maybe you consider design, build, or construction management. What happens in the design build? Well, the design build situation is traditionally a company that designs your project and builds your project. The downfall with that, okay, there are 2 ways to go about that. The one is the DB company, which has both the designer and the builder under the same roof. The downfall with that is that you don't have any go-between to protect you. He's gonna design it and build it, and you don't really know if he's building what he designed, because he might be cutting corners to make some dollars. Partnering is a better approach to design build, where you have a contractor and an architect who aren't a part of the same business, but they agree to work together in a design build situation. And the good thing about that is that you bring the contractor on board early so he can have his input in the design, because oftentimes the contractor has a little better, he has preferred methods for putting things together. And if you can incorporate his methods in your design, then you're gonna save some dollars. So having the builder on board early can be an advantage, but you're not gonna get the lowest cost that way. It's not to say that he's gonna be extremely elevated from a bid cost, but it won't be the lowest cost because he's not forced to be extremely competitive. Construction management is a process where a construction manager, which is usually a contractor, manages the project pretty much from start to finish. The normal way this works is that the construction manager hires the architect. It's sort of like partnering, but a little bit different because they're more directly associated. The architect is working for the contractor and not for you. The great thing about design bid build is the architect is your advocate. So he's on your side and he represents you with the contractor. Okay, in the construction management situation, the architect is going to be working for the contractor, so he's going to be less likely to advocate for you, I guess. And the way that usually works is a GMP, a guaranteed maximum price. So you'll, once you get to kind of a schematic design level where you know enough about the project that he can put the pricing together, he's going to give you a guaranteed maximum price. And then he's going to work on a time and materials basis, not to exceed that number. Okay, so obviously the downfall of that is he knows what this number is and he can kind of inch towards that number as long as he doesn't go over it. He really doesn't have any, other than goodwill, he doesn't have any motivation to do it for his, the best possible dollar. Again, the good thing about design, building, construction management is that everybody's working together as a team to get through the process. There are sometimes some adversarial issues that come up in the design bid build situation where the contractor is the lowest bidder and he's going to be combing over the architect's documents to look for opportunities to make more money. It's just the way it works. If the architect leaves something out, then he's going to have to charge you for that. And obviously, materials are far less expensive on bid day than they are on any day thereafter. Okay, so then, so after we choose our delivery method, we've done our master planning, then we're going to go into a process called schematic design. And that's basically taking the master plan and choosing those phases that you're going to concentrate on and developing them to the next step. And you're going to create a site plan and a floor plan and some kind of graphic that describes what this project really looks like. So you'll have a site plan, a floor plan, and a couple pretty pictures. And then your architect should be able to give you probably a plus or minus 10 to 15% estimate to go with that. And then that is usually what gets taken to fundraising. So you present that to your congregation for the fundraising aspect. Now it's important, we haven't really touched on this, but you need to keep your congregation in the loop all through this process. You need to be reporting back to them on progress and where you are, and so it's not a surprise to them what you're doing when you come to ask for money. And also going back to visioning and branding, if you have developed this vision and you have been communicating that vision to your congregation all along, and they're going to be on board with you to make this happen, because we know that we need this new children's wing because we have 40 kids living over here in this neighborhood and they need to be reached, and we don't have the space to reach them. That's why we need to do this, and whatever. You need to be communicating that vision to your congregation often and in as many different ways as you can, so that they're on board with you when we get to this point. Okay, fundraising. I have to say that I'm not an expert in this area, but just from my experience, most churches that are doing a project of any size will bring in a capital campaign consultant. And there are a number of them. We can help you find one of those. A lot of denominations actually have some of that within their denomination. So anyway, the most important thing is congregational preparedness, again, promoting and that vision and asking for support for it. The capital campaign consultant, there are, I know of one group, they're out of Indiana, he is a former pastor, so he understands some of these issues, and he takes a very spiritual approach to the fundraising aspect. I think it's important to have that aspect in your campaign consultant, that there may be a series of messages that get delivered prior to this, or somehow your vision and you need to just get everybody on board for thinking about how this needs to go down the road. Now, this consultant says that sacrificial giving is required. You can't expect to get to where you need to go with overage funding, like I got a bonus this year, so I'll apply that to your project, or surplus giving is not going to get you there. It's going to take sacrificial giving. And obviously we need to be preaching that this is above and beyond your tithe, because you can't replace the building fund with your tithe, because the church will be in serious issues in that regard. So sacrificial giving is required, and it takes a spiritual experience to get to that point. So a spiritually based capital campaign consultant, in my view, is important, critical. So the fundraising methods are obviously savings. Capital campaign is usually based on obtaining pledges and donations, pledges over a long period of time. I've never actually experienced this, but you can sell bonds to your congregation, and then obviously loans. The campaign consultant folks tell you that you could expect in the pledges and donations area, expect to bring in somewhere between 2 and 5 times your annual budget over probably a 3-year period. So that just gives you a ballpark on what to expect. I suppose budget should be a little bit more, like in my church, we have a budget, but then there's reality, which is much less than the budget. So.
Do you recommend that a church, if they have, like we're in the middle of phase 1, we've got phase 2, 3, 4, looking ahead. Do you recommend that in that case that a church budget a percentage, like 5 or 10% of their budget towards building remodels or, additions? So, or do you just recommend, And the reality is, you know, if we're not making budget, then something's gotta get cut, and it'd probably be that, but if we are making budget, would you recommend that, or would you just recommend just special offerings?
I don't know, I think that's kind of a personal preference.
Okay.
Definitely, I don't know, you don't wanna really drag out building funding, I mean, you don't wanna wear people out with it, but, it's obviously a key aspect, but I guess, I know of some churches who are doing like a 3-year capital campaign, followed by a 3-year capital campaign, followed by a 3-year capital campaign. I just can't imagine by the time you get to those last 3 years, you're gonna be doing much good, but I don't know. So certainly if the money is there and you can budget it and your congregation is behind budgeting it, then sure, it's probably a great idea. But, cause I suppose that's really maybe the more out of mind, or out of sight, out of mind way to do it, really, if you can do that. I don't know, there's probably not a large number of churches that are in that situation today, but yeah. If it can be done, great. Okay, so once we have done the schematic design and we've raised the funds, design development is the next phase. Now, design development can be done during fundraising, depending on your schedule and your confidence and your aggressiveness, I guess. Design development can be done during fundraising. And some churches will say, well, we're gonna do this fundraising aspect, but we don't really want to shut down the design process. We want to keep the project moving forward. But others will say, well, we don't really have the money to pay for design development anyway, so we're gonna wait until we get some money raised to move forward with design development. So design development is taking that schematic design and moving it forward to approximately 50% design completion. And at that point, well, it's important to identify any bid alternate items you're gonna have. So like, for example, if you have a couple different phases that you're gonna price separately, you need to identify those so the documents can start to go together accordingly. Because if you head down this road of just creating one massive project that's gonna ask for one price and then later you decide you wanna break it out, it's a lot more difficult to do. So knowing that earlier on is better. And there may be several other, there could be half a dozen alternate bid items that you wanna get pricing separately for, so you can determine whether you really wanna spend that money or not. Okay, so all the systems and the materials will be defined at the end of design development, and you'll be approximately 50% complete with your documents, and you should be able to get a plus or minus 10% cost estimate at this time. It's important that the owner reviews the documents carefully at the end of design development. Get those construction experience members to look over the documents and make sure that everything that you're looking for is in there. No, it's kind of needle in the haystack stuff in some instances, but just make sure you're being properly accommodated, because the documents that are being prepared by your architect are going to become legal documents, and the contractor is going to be bound to provide what's shown in the documents and nothing more, especially in a bid build situation. So make sure that you're being covered to the best of your knowledge and ability. Okay, so then there's the construction documents phase that follows the design development phase, and that's where the actual documents that the contractor will bid from are prepared by the architect, and this is where the architect's going to spend the majority of his time throughout the process during this phase. So between design development and construction documents is probably about 65% of the architect's time in the process. And sometimes the line between design development and construction documents gets blurred, they kind of run together, but that's where the majority of your architect's time is spent. So he's gonna come out at the end of this with another cost estimate that should be more refined than the last one, so it should be between 5 and 10% accurate. And again, the owner's gonna review those before they go to the contractor, just to make sure that, again, to the best of your knowledge and ability, your needs and desires are being met in the documents. Okay, so then there's bidding and negotiating. If you're doing the design, build, or construction management situation, some of this bidding and negotiating has probably been ongoing for some time, but in a design bid situation, this is when the documents go out to the contractors and they get pricing. As a church, you are, you have the ability to close your list of bidders, and you don't have to invite the entire world to bid your project. So if you have a half a dozen guys that you know about, that you trust and want to price your project, you make sure that they're aware of your project and invite them to come bid your project. You can, like I said, you can close that down to those people, because especially in an environment like this where people are hungry, you're going to get, when people find out about your project, they're going to be calling to ask if they can bid it. And while in some certain circumstances, the more people you get involved, the lower your numbers theoretically should go, but you want to make sure that you're only inviting qualified people. And then you need to remember that once you open the door for one guy, it's going to be hard to close it on the next guy. So develop your list carefully of maybe a half a dozen, I would say 8 tops, probably not, half a dozen is a pretty good top number to get your half a dozen guys you feel comfortable with getting numbers from, and ask them to bid your project. Then you're going to select the bidder, and keep in mind that the lowest number is not always the best number. Yes.
These qualified bidders, is that something that an architect can recommend?
Your architect should be able to help you with that. You may have a list of guys that you know about, and he may have a list of guys that he knows about, and you merge those together. Just make sure, I run into situations, especially in rural situations, where Joe Blow down the street does house construction and we want him to bid the project. Well,
Yeah.
this is a little more complicated than that, and he may well be qualified, but he may not be. So you just make sure you've done your homework in that regard, and you're only inviting qualified people. Okay, usually the low bidder is low because he left something out. So just keep that in mind. Most guys will suck it up and do the project, but they always have, prior to signing the contract, they have the option of bailing out. So just keep that in mind. When you ask for a bid bond, which usually you're not going to do when you have a closed list of invited people, but if you do ask for a bid bond, that bid bond guarantees their bid. So if they do back out, then their bid bond covers those costs. So keep in mind, a lot of times you'll have the contractor bid his time as well as his costs. So what's his proposed schedule to get through your project? And that can vary somewhat widely. Some guys want to get in there and get it done quickly. Some guys, if you have a small project, they're just going to want to infill that over in and around their other projects.
For example, with us, we ended up asking 6 bidders. We had 4 that came back when it's all said and done, and they ranged from the low bidder of $84,000 to the high bidder of $120,000, with the bidder at $99,000 and another bidder at $110,000. And we ended up going with the low bidder, but we sat down with the architect, we interviewed him, and like, what are we missing? You know, what are you missing? And he went through, architect was very much our advocate and really grilled him, and so we still, when it's all said and done, felt confident. And on top of being the low bidder, everyone else said it'd take 90 days, he said it'd take 60, and we're now at 45 days and we're done. So in this case, the contractor had a narrow window where he knew he had no jobs and he wanted a job before a big job kicked in. And so in this case, it really worked out well for us.
True. So what I said earlier is not always true, but
But you,
I've
you're
had
right.
those calls where you call them up and tell them that they're the low bidder, and they say, yeah, we left out that.
One of the things about the low bidders is a couple of years down the road, when you've got some serious building problems, you're probably gonna find they're out of business.
Yeah. Well, that's why you wanna make sure you're inviting the qualified guys, the guys that you can trust. And there again, there may be a lower number than you're gonna get out of those 6 guys, but you probably don't want that number. Okay, then there's the, yes,
It's also, you know, you want to maybe get a little bit of business, you know, do some checking.
right. Well, the guys I would recommend to you would have a kind of a long track record and respectability and trustability and that sort of thing. Which again, may not give you the absolute lowest number available, but the lowest recommended number. How's that? Okay, so then there's a process that's come known as value engineering. It's kind of a dumb slogan, but basically what that is when your project comes in a little above where you would like for it to be, is sitting down with usually the low bidder and talking through where the numbers are and how you might be able to get to the number that you need to get to. So maybe there are some compromises in materials and whatnot. And, I've been through this process a few times, but don't overlook the small numbers. I mean, a lot of times you'll think, well, we gotta find $100,000 and that's only $2,500 bucks. But when you add several of those $2,500 bucks, it starts to make a difference. So don't overlook even the small ones. I mean, obviously you're trying to find the big ones that you could live without. But oftentimes there aren't very many big ones, so you're gonna have to pile together a bunch of little ones to get to where you wanna be. So anyway, just know that that process is there. If your number comes in higher than you would like, there's always the opportunity to sit down with those bidders and talk through where the numbers are to get to where you need to go. Okay, so your architect should help you select your bidder, like John was talking about. The architect sitting down and talking with the contractor, making sure that everything's in order. And then your architect can help you with the construction contract. There are a couple different standard contracts out there. The AIA, the American Institute of Architects, puts out several different types of contracts for construction. They are pretty neutrally
They're generic, fill in the blank kind of.
yeah, and it's pretty authored neutrally, I guess. If there is any favoritism, obviously it goes towards the architect because it comes from a group of architects. But it's really they're really pretty fair documents. The AGC, which is the American General Contractor, or Associated General Contractors, they have some standard documents as well, and if there is any slant there, it's going to go towards the contractor. So, but both of those documents are generally pretty fairly written. And then obviously you have the capability of involving an attorney, which always frustrates architects, but it's not a bad idea. So. Okay, this expectations thing is something I just have had some experience with this. Understand that construction is imperfect. There are going to be issues. Something's going to go wrong. It may not be big, but something's going to go a little bit different than the way you wanted it to go. And the important thing is to maintain your Christian values and to work through the problems. Okay, I was involved in a project where, I have to be kind of careful here, but, a member of the church donated some material to the project. There was a very generic conversation with the contractor asking where this material should be applied, and the contractor sort of arm waved, it goes over there, and the owner took his word literally and applied it over there, and it turned out that that wasn't exactly right, that they should have done a little more homework and placed it a little bit differently. And so the owner comes back to the contractor, wanting some compensation. And, there was heated discussion, and the owner, which was a church, technically called the contractor a liar, and da-da-da-da-da. Well, keep in mind who you're representing, okay? And this contractor probably didn't have the greatest Christian experience that he should have, and now that he knows a few certain Christians, he's certain that he doesn't want to be one. So just keep in mind, we do want the best outcome possible, and there's always a solution to the problem. Sometimes there is some compromise required, but just keep in mind that clear communication and level heads are far superior to heated name calling and whatnot in working through your issues. But do understand there will be issues. Okay. Communication is critically important. Change orders will happen, but hopefully they'll be to a minimum.
And there's two deals there. Communications, I've always found out there's nothing that can't be solved with communications. When there's lack of communications, then you have problems. And then on the change orders, it is, if it's changed, you best get it down on paper and there's no miscommunications between the builder and
Yes, absolutely. There is, you will have or you should have a written, signed contract that defines everybody's roles, and the change order form becomes a part of that contract, and it does need to be documented in written as well as graphic form when necessary to define what needs to happen. Okay, retainage is customary in a construction contract where the owner, the contractor is going to bill for the amount of work that he's done over the last month, okay? So he's going to say he's done 10% of the work over this last month. The architect, if you have hired him to advocate for you during construction, it's his responsibility to pass judgment on the contractor's ask for funds, to make sure that he has actually performed to that level. And then the owner, it's traditional for the owner to hold 5 to 10% of what the contractor is asking for until the end of the project. So it's basically motivation for the contractor to finish. I can assure you, if he has his money, he's not motivated to finish the project. And there are, on a larger project, there's seemingly an endless number of little details that need to be wrapped up to be complete. Okay. And usually what happens is you'll hold maybe 10% of their money up to the point that the project is 50% complete, and then you'll have a pretty large sum of money to hold out until the end. We usually don't hold retainage all the way to the end of the project, but depending on the size of your project, that's kind of up to you how that works. Okay, then the punch list is where you walk through your newly constructed project with your architect. I would recommend not necessarily bringing the entire building committee, but the building committee chair and a staff person attending with your architect to walk through the facility. Your engineers will also be present to determine things that haven't been completed as they should have been, or things that might have been damaged during construction that need repaired. Technically, it's the contractor's responsibility to prepare this list beforehand, but that rarely happens. And it's usually the architect that develops the list after the walkthrough. And it's a list of items that the contractor needs to address to be complete. Substantial completion is a term that's used to define or to describe your project when it is complete to the point that it would be acceptable to occupy. So it may not be 100% complete, but it's complete enough to use. So that point is a critical point in the legal terminology in the contracts, because that point is where the architect will issue a certificate of substantial completion marking that milestone, and you are allowed to occupy your facility at that time, and it starts the clock on the warranty. So your project is typically warranted for 1 year from this date. And then at that point is when your retainage is released, but you need to understand that you don't want to release all of your retainage until the project is 100% complete. But you also don't have the right to retain the entire retainage when he reaches substantial completion. He's entitled to at least a portion of that percentage. But you do need to hold out some that's enough to motivate him to finish your punch list. So,
I worked at I was at a church, and we had completed a building, and they wanted all their money at the end, and there was a good list of things. And it was literally the only thing that we had to get them to finish some of the things they said they were gonna do. So yeah, unfortunately, that can be
don't
frustrating.
let it get away too early. Okay, when you occupy your building, you'll notice some things that might fall short of where you thought they should be. Keep a list of those. And if they're significant enough, you should contact your contractor and have him come out and address those. But if they're kind of minor, you can hang on. Well, you should make him aware of them anyway. Maybe a couple months into the living in your space, you send him a list of things that still need to be addressed. And he may not be extremely motivated to address all those for a little bit, but there is the 1 year warranty walkthrough should occur at 11 months. You need to take responsibility as your owner to schedule this, because it gets overlooked a high percentage of time. So the architect usually doesn't take the responsibility to schedule this, and the contractor certainly won't take the responsibility to schedule this. So you as the owner need to take the responsibility for scheduling your warranty walkthrough, which should occur 11 months after substantial completion, which will give the contractor a month to address those issues before the 1 year warranty period runs out. Okay, we're getting close to the end. Here is a tentative schedule that you should plug into your mind. So if you're going to go through an architect selection process where you're actually going to talk to half a dozen architects and narrow it down and interview 2 or 3 and pick one, it's going to take about a month to get through that process. Could take a little bit longer, but at least allow a month to get through the process, to get the documentation out, to sort through the response, and to narrow it down and interview those that you want to interview. Programming, which is, as we talked about earlier, is defining your project. That can take about a month, and that can be done by you, or it can be done by your architect. A certain amount of it will probably be done by your architect just for his comfort level, but the majority of it can be done by you if you feel confident in that regard. And, but if your architect is doing it, you should allow a month, okay? Master planning will take at least a month, maybe 6 weeks, depending. I guess a lot of these things, typically an architect is gonna be able to work fast enough to keep up with the ability of a church to get everybody together for a meeting. So, so he should be able to keep up, and you are gonna have some control over whether this goes faster or slower, based on your ability to get people together. Okay, schematic design will also take at least a month. I guess these are kind of minimum time frames. Fundraising can vary a little bit, but the actual pledging usually takes place over like a 3-year period, but the actual gathering of those pledges and donations can take a couple of months, and it depends a little bit on your process, how much you might want to how much you might want to prepare for that in advance and some of those kinds of things. But usually a couple of months is designated from the time you come up with the presentation materials to the time you've received all of the pledges and donations. Construction documents, depending again on the complexity of your project, but should allow about 3 months for well, if you're doing something less than $1 million, you can get it done quicker than the 3 months, but 1 to 3 million will take about 3 months, and then a bigger project could take a little bit longer. And then construction also varies on the size of your project, but any significant, $1 to $3 million project, you should allow about a year to get through. Obviously, if you're doing a little remodel that's $100,000, you're going to get it done a lot faster than that. But a significant $1 to $3 million project is, you need to allow about a year. Usually, a lot of times they'll get done in 8 to 9 months, but allow for a year. So overall, you could be talking 2 years from the time you start to the time you're actually done with your project. Now these time frames are kind of over maybe more of a new church build kind of thing rather than addition and remodel, but there's lots of things that can get in the way, so allow yourself a couple of years for a significant project. So thank you guys for allowing me to be here today. I hope some of this was helpful. Feel free to contact me at any time with your questions. I'd be happy to help.
Do you have cards today?
Questions now. I do have cards today. I've got a couple of booklets up here too to kind of show you a little bit about some of the stuff that I've done if you're interested.
20% off coupons, do you get those?
Yeah.
We'll see if we can find some of those in here. Where did I put them? Here we go. Questions?
I think you covered pretty good.
So, was it helpful at all? Was it far too boring?
Covered a lot of stuff that wouldn't think about.
Are there things that we didn't cover that you would like to know more about, or?
We know what we're gonna do, we just gotta figure out a way to do it now.
Well, I think it can be almost a little overwhelming. I mean, for us, we started, I became pastor in March of last year, and by June, I started sitting down with our trustees and saying, there's obviously a lot, the building, 30-year-old carpet, we had asbestos tile in our offices for the flooring. Turns out we also had it everywhere else. When we ripped up the carpet, it was everywhere. But you just don't mess with it, go over it, and you can do that as long as you don't remove it. But I mean, we started, I mean, we sat down in June, and I had personally as a pastor, a long list of things. Listen, I think this needs to get done, this parking lot, you know, children's wing, bathrooms. But I sat down with our trustees and just said, hey, what do you feel? And, you know, by the time that hour-plus long meeting was over, they had talked about everything that I had wanted to work on. And so then we sat down as the trustees and started prioritizing. And then we hired an architect, and then we got on with an architect through we started with the design build, and then we dropped the builder and kept the architect. And then we ended up backtracking, asking the church what they thought was needed. They had some really good input. Then we had to repay the architect to do some stuff over again. That kind of worked up our trustees a little bit, but we paid him to do this. Then we changed our mind, so he had to redo it. Well, he has to recharge us. So I would really say, I highly encourage what Doug is saying is do the surveys, talk to the church and bring them in. Let them know at least to start praying about this and get their feedback. I mean, because that would have saved us a couple $1,000s if we had done that from the beginning. And then I think ultimately is don't get overwhelmed. You know, take it and phase it out. Make your phases smaller and take it a chunk at a time rather than looking at, look at this big problem. Well, yeah, but we can do this and start getting them some momentum. I mean, we're having our celebration service this next Sunday, the 14th, and I'm expecting, I'm expecting people to give more money to the next phase because they've seen what's happened.
So Doug, what does $1 million buy these days in new construction?
That's a good question. How many seats in a sanctuary?
Sanctuary space will go for about $150 a square foot to do something fairly nice, but not extremely spectacular. Just regular like classroom space, somewhere between $100 and $115.
What he said was, is a highly important point. You want to keep your whole congregation involved. The more you make your congregation feel involved, the more they're going to be eager to be.
Financially, yeah.
If they buy into it, just like ministry, if they buy into it, you get people involved in your ministries, then becomes their ministry too.
I'll show you this software if you are interested, just in kind of what you can expect out of it. This is a little engineering office that they wanted to remodel, and so this is kind of their existing plan. It was an office before, but as you can see from this photo, it doesn't make a very great presence to the street. I mean, it's not a bad looking building really, but it's not, it doesn't really.
Dentist office.
Yeah. So we decided we were gonna rework this corner a little bit to create a new entrance into this building, which the main entrance really was in the back because all the parking was in the back, but they wanted to be able to make a statement to the street and provide a new entrance. So this software you can use, let's see here. So that was kind of their existing floor plan. We went from there to a kind of a sketchy, hand sketched floor plan. So this is kind of what was our first proposal for a floor plan. So we were going to carve out this space underneath the existing structure and create a new entrance and a new reception area. And then just kind of open office areas and offices around the perimeter. And then, so back in the old days, this is pretty much what you would get, is this floor plan sketch and this elevation sketch. And say, wow, wasn't it great? You're ready to move forward. Ready to spend your $250,000. Anyway, so we took it from there, and obviously it got tweaked a little bit here and there, but so in the end it became this is kind of the floor plan with again that new entry area being carved out of there. the new conference room here in the front, and the reception area inside the door, and then just kind of open office space. They reworked the toilets to be ADA compliant, turned their former reception space into a break room, and they have a conference room in the back, which was originally a conference room, so. But the great thing about this is, well, let me show you this was kind of the final design in 3D, so we kind of popped that corner up in the air, really without doing any major structural work. We're just working within the existing structure. We did kind of have to add a little bit of structure to support this higher wall, but it just kind of gives it a different look and more of a presence of the street. But what's kind of cool about this, let me see if I can find it, is once you build this thing, you can kind of swing around here and look at it from any angle you want. And so you're going to know exactly what you're getting into before you get into it. And you can get different views of it. You can look at you get your black and white view there, or you can, it's working on coloring it. You can get your kind of cartoon colors, or then back on that cover sheet, you can get your semi-realistic, it's not exactly photorealistic, but semi-realistic rendering. And then the great thing about it is once you get to that model point and you're showing off your pretty pictures, you're also creating your construction documents in the same file. So
Can you see the inside of the building through that?
yes, it's well, let me see if I can just do that real quick. Go over here to this floor plan. So, oops, that's the wrong one. So if we were going to take a view of the reception area, for example, we can establish a camera over here in the corner of
That's
the
cool.
deal and just plug it over there, and it generates a view for you.
That's cool.
So obviously there's a bunch of kind of trashy looking stuff in there that is part of the construction documents, but you can get a feel for what's really going on there.
That's cool.
So,
Did good, appreciate it, thank you.
well, thank you guys. I hope it was of some assistance anyway.
Yeah,
So-
no, a lot actually. It doesn't make it so daunting.
Good.
Yes. That's what
We just gotta get it past the Amarillo City Council.
But we know somebody now.
That's right.
We'd like to put in a petting zoo, and he said it'd be all
Yeah, you would think being on that committee, well, I'll just say I've had my own challenges with them, so.
That was one of the most difficult things that we went through, just to get our parking lot.
Yeah, cards and booklets and stuff are available if you want them. I'm sure they're not gonna be shoving them down your throat, but I'd be happy to help you out if you need it.